Hi and welcome to my channel Explain, featuring the tackiest Christmas earrings you have ever seen. I practiced that hair flip. Hi and welcome to my channel Explain. My name is EK and in this video I'm going to talk about mothers. A few weeks ago I posted a video discussing royal sisters, principally the sisters of kings. Some of these women were heavily involved in their brothers' reigns, others found themselves kind of married to powerful men as part of their brothers' foreign policies, while others changed the dynastic fortunes of kingdoms by passing the claim of their fathers down to their descendants. And today I want to look at royal and elite women again, but not their relationship with their brothers, nor their fathers, nor their sons, but their daughters. In some cases, in quite a few cases, the kind of personal connection between mother and daughter is really difficult to draw out. But in others we have, primary source evidence indicating their kind of amity or lack of. So I have a whole range to discuss. Before we begin, some trigger warnings. This video will discuss the marriage of children, underage girls, with the kind of implications of SA of those said underage girls. It also discusses the kind of emotional and possibly physical A of a child. I will endeavour to put kind of timestamps below so that you can skip ahead if needed. If, as Jane Austen tells us, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife, then it is also a truth universally acknowledged that a medieval queen in possession of many daughters must be in want of finding them auspicious husbands. And few could claim better success at this task than Joan Beaufort, Queen Consort of James I of Scotland. All of her 6 daughters made impressive matches. The eldest, Margaret, was married to the heir to the French throne. Isabella married the Duke of Brittany, Mary, a Dutch count, Joan, the Earl of Morton, and Annabella, the Count of Geneva, although this was eventually annulled, and Eleanor married an Austrian archduke. Whether these matches were kind of explicitly the work of Joan is kind of difficult to say, but it is notable that all but one of them took place while Joan was part of the minority government that was ruling on behalf of her young son James II. Remaining in Scotland, I want, as I always do, to talk about Margaret Tudor. You can make a video without mentioning Margaret Tudor challenge. I don't want to win at that. I will happily fail. Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth of York, Margaret's grandmother and mother respectively, successfully delayed Margaret's marriage to James IV of Scotland by at least a few months, as they felt she was too young, although she was in fact at the age of majority deemed appropriate by the church, which was usually around 12, and I think she was 13 when she married James. You will very often see that she was 14, but she wasn't, because the wedding took place in August and she did not turn 14 until the November. Incidentally, you sometimes will read that James IV actually delayed consummating the marriage with Margaret because he felt she was too young, and it is the case that she didn't get pregnant until I think 1507 was kind of her first documented pregnancy, but I have not found any evidence, whether primary source or people, like when people are talking about it, they're not really referencing anything specific. So I was already kind of skeptical about that. And having kind of read this several times when I was doing my dissertation research for my dissertation about Margaret Tudor, the reason I think people say that is because James IV was a really popular king, and he still is kind of considered quite beloved in Scottish history. And I really think it was a case of people not wanting to face up to the fact that he was 35, he was in his 30s, and she was 13, and so I think that's actually more telling of what we wish would have happened rather than what probably actually happened. Margaret had 2 children who survived to adulthood. With James IV of Scotland she had a son who became James V, and then with her second husband, Archibald Douglas, she had a daughter called Margaret Douglas. Margaret Douglas actually spent most of her life in England at the court of her uncle Henry VIII, and in 1536 she actually kind of incurred her uncle's wrath as she had married without his consent. Despite living apart for most of their lives, Margaret Tudor intervened on her daughter's behalf in this instance, and when Margaret Tudor died in 1541 she asked that her jewellery be given to Margaret Douglas, but James V ignored her kind of deathbed wish. In comparison, Margaret Tudor's mother, Elizabeth of York, had spent a lot of time with her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, the wife of Edward IV of England. In 1417, when Edward IV was briefly ousted from his throne, Queen Elizabeth, who was at that time heavily pregnant, took herself into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, and we can presume that her children, including her daughter and namesake, did too. Then, in the tumultuous events following the death of Edward IV in 1483, Elizabeth Woodville took her children once again into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey after her eldest son, now Edward V, King of England, had been seized by his uncle and nominal protector, Richard. That we now know Richard as Richard III of England kind of explains how that little knot worked itself out, and Elizabeth Woodville had no choice really but to submit on the condition that her daughters would be looked after and appropriate marriages would have been found. Various marriages had been discussed for Elizabeth of York throughout her life prior to this that fell through, which was not uncommon in this era. At this time, royal and aristocratic children might be betrothed from infancy, although these betrothals could actually be set aside before the marriage actually took place. Elizabeth of York's eventual suitor was none other than Henry Tudor, and their marriage joined the houses of York and Lancaster, putting an end to the kind of internecine 15th century conflict that became known as the Wars of the Roses. The marriage didn't take place until after Henry's victory at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, in which Richard III was cut down in the field, but Henry declared his intention to marry Elizabeth as early as the winter of 1483. This arrangement appears to have come about through their respective mothers, as Elizabeth Woodville kind of put aside old differences to ally with her rival Lancastrian matriarch Margaret Beaufort. Woodville's life after the Tudor conquest seems quite quiet. She retired to Bermondsey Abbey with a pension in the late 1480s and left no worldly goods to bequeath to her children at her death in 1492. Her daughters did all attend her funeral except for Elizabeth of York because she was heavily pregnant at the time. Elizabeth of York's relationship with her mother-in-law, Margaret Beaufort, has been characterised as quite unequal, and Margaret was certainly a force to be reckoned with and dominated court to an extent that Elizabeth may well have found disquieting. However, there are plenty of examples of collaboration between the two and their joint insistence, as I mentioned before, that the marriage of Margaret Tudor was delayed. They also co-sponsored literary works. They commissioned a printing of a work called The 15 O's, and they gifted a printing of Walter Hilton's Scala Perfectionis to one of Elizabeth's ladies. So even though Elizabeth of York, I think it's kind of implied that because Elizabeth of York kind of was slightly more in the background, that it was because Margaret Beaufort kind of supplanted her position, and I just don't know if that's true. And we can kind of see from this kind of literary work that, you know, there was some kind of a working relationship between the two at the very least. Literary patronage was something in which many kind of elite and royal women occupied themselves, and some of these commissions related to education, particularly the education of daughters. Women of kind of like the gentry class up were often expected to have a role in the education of their children. This was in part influenced by the popularity of St. Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary, who is very often depicted teaching the young Mary to read. Mary was one of the most popular saints in late medieval Europe, and veneration of her parents was similarly prevalent. The French writer Christine de Pizan writes in her text, The Treasure of the City of Ladies, that the, quote, wise princess watches over the upbringing and education of her daughters. The older they get, the more careful she will be. And we can see this in several kind of maternal relationships. Catherine of Aragon likely commissioned the text by Louise Vives, The Education of a Christian Woman, for her daughter Mary Tudor. And Anne of Brittany had a primer, which is a type of prayer book, written for her daughter Claude of Brittany. Anne de Beaujeu, sister to King Charles VIII, herself wrote an instruction book titled Lessons for My Daughter for her only daughter, Suzanne de Bourbon. These didactic texts would implicitly include religious instruction, but some daughters had a more immersive religious education, such as the daughters of St. Margaret of Scotland. Margaret was Queen of Scots in the 11th century through her marriage to Malcolm III in 1070, and the pair had 8 children, all of whom survived to adulthood. As her sainthood implies, Margaret was a deeply pious woman, and her 2 daughters, Edith Matilda Matilda and Mary were sent to religious institutions in the south of England to be educated, firstly at Romsey Abbey and then at Wilton Abbey. It was quite common for elite women to spend time in convents. Margaret herself spent her adolescence at Wilton Abbey, as did Edith of Wessex. Margaret may not have been the one to decide that Edith, Matilda and Mary were going to be sent away to be educated, but as her sister Christina was at that time Abbess of Romsey, that hints to me that she kind of had some say in the arrangement. I recently visited Romsey Abbey and it's absolutely beautiful. It's very kind of out of the way, and some of the kind of old abbey buildings are not there, or at least not visible. But yeah, it was beautiful. It's a beautiful place. I think it kind of loses out compared to some of the other kind of local sites like Salisbury Cathedral and Stonehenge. That's a little bit far from them. I think it took us about, I don't know, like half an hour. But it was lovely. I highly recommend it. It was very cool and quiet and still an acting parish church. There wasn't much about Christina, unfortunately. I was kind of hoping. She obviously gets mentioned, but a lot of it is more talking about other abbesses and saints that are associated with the abbey. So that's EK's tourist information for you. It was almost, I think all of it, except for a couple of the chapels off the side, was wheelchair accessible, which is not really the norm in some of these old buildings. But yeah, I recommend. It has the EK stamp of approval. Neither Edith Matilda nor Mary ended up taking vows, and they both were eventually married. Mary to Eustace, the Count of Boulogne, and Edith Matilda to Henry I, King of England. I want to talk about Edith Matilda and her relationship with Margaret specifically because so much of what we know, like the overwhelming majority of what we know about Margaret, the reason that she's now kind of one of Scotland's patron saints is because of her daughter. Usually Edith Matilda's name is given as Queen Matilda or sometimes Queen Maud, but she was baptised as Edith and no one is really sure why or when it was changed to Matilda. As I study both kind of the English and the Scottish contexts, I tend to use both names at once just to kind of avoid confusion as much as possible. As I said, Edith Matilda spent the majority of her childhood in England with her aunt Christina before marrying Henry I of England, who was a son of William the Conqueror in 1100 and thus living and kind of presiding over the royal court as its queen. Unsurprisingly, Edith Matilda did not feel that she knew her mother well, and to remedy this, she commissioned a vita, or spiritual biography of her mother to be written by a monk called Turgot. I think it's Turgot, it could be Turgot. It seems, I don't know, I'm getting the sense it's Turgot. I can't even have the excuse that I usually do of like, oh, well, I, did my undergrad online, blah, 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 so I've never heard these things. Like, one of the professors I had at postgrad, I had him for 2 classes, and he talked about this guy a lot, and I can't remember how he pronounced it. But there we go.
Sorry to this man.
Turgot prefaces his work with an address to Edith Matilda, writing, quote, "So that although you little knew the countenance of your mother, you might have fuller notice of her virtues." The vita includes kind of the classic hallmarks of hagiography. Margaret is deeply pious, excessively penitent, and an ardent reformer of the Celtic Church. Conveniently, Margaret favours a lot of the reforms that Turgot himself championed. But there is a secondary thread to this vita, a thread which certainly would have concerned Edith Matilda and her brothers. The text expends significant energy at the start outlining the noble lineage of Margaret. Margaret was a princess of the House of Wessex, the pre-Norman dynasty of England, which included big hitters like Alfred the Great, Ethelred the Unready, Edmund Ironside and Edward the Confessor. Edmund Ironside was actually Margaret's grandfather, and thus Edward the Confessor was her great uncle. So why does Turgot occupy himself so thoroughly with Margaret's kind of dynastic heritage? Why would Edith Matilda want there to be this focus on her mother's genealogy? There's 2 reasons. Edith Matilda's father, Malcolm, had a brother. Malcolm also had 2 sons from a previous marriage. Both the brother and one of the sons sought to claim the throne of Scotland after Malcolm's death. By the time of the Vita's production in the early 1100s, Edith Matilda's brothers had won that little kind of civil tangle, but one of the elder half-brothers had a son. It stands to reason then that Edith Matilda and her full brothers had a vested interest in promoting the distinguished lineage of their mother, as it was the main thing setting them apart from their father's other relations. Margaret was their secret weapon, she was their advantage. The second reason concerns Edith Matilda Matilda's husband, King Henry I of England. His dynasty, the Norman dynasty, had supplanted the House of Wessex, so by emphasising his wife's mother's lineage, he kind of incorporated that Wessex heritage into his own rule and could present his reign as the joining together of these two kind of disparate rival families. As I said, so much of what we know about Margaret and kind of relations between England and Scotland in this era come from that vita, and thus come from the relationship, however distant, between mother and daughter. Moving on to more profane matters, we have examples of mothers not simply or not only raising their daughters and arranging marriages, but also kind of bequeathing upon them immense power. And this is no more apparent than with Mary, Queen of Scots, and her mother, Marie de Guise. Marie's entire public existence from 1542 onwards was securing her daughter's kingdom and its relationship with France. But after 1548, Marie would see her daughter just once before her death in 1560. I'm going to focus more so on Marie than Mary because the latter is somewhat overrepresented in the kind of popular history space through no fault of her own. But it kind of was, it wasn't like her fault, but the reason that we talk about her a lot is because she made some questionable choices. So it's partly her fault, but you know, I won't hold it against her. Marie de Guise, who is often anglicised to Mary of Guise, but to prevent or at least kind of limit confusion, I'm going to refer to her as Marie. Marie was the daughter of the powerful Duke of Guise and his wife Antoinette de Bourbon. Sarah Gristwood says that Antoinette was likely kind of one of the biggest influences on Marie, stating that Antoinette was, quote, forceful and devout. And the French King Francis I thought of Marie almost as if she were his own daughter. She was married to the Duke of Longueville in 1534, but then widowed in 1537. Hearing of this eligible young bride, and freshly widowed himself after the death of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII expressed interest in Marie, not least because she was tall, healthy, and had borne the Duke of Longueville 2 sons. The story goes that Marie declined these overtures with the comment that she may be a remarkably tall woman, but, quote, my neck is small. In the end, Marie's second husband was James V of Scotland. They married in 1538, and in 1542 she gave birth to a daughter named Mary. Now, daughters are far more useful to kings than the likes of Henry VIII would imply. They were the glue of international relations, cementing alliances, brokering peace, and bridging cultural gaps between kingdoms. It was less desirable, however, that they would run countries as monarchs. So when James V died, just 6 days after Mary's birth, leaving Mary as his only true-born heir, the uphill battle to force the Scots to accept their first queen regnant since the uncrowned Maid of Norway in the 13th century began. And Marie de Guise would undoubtedly emerge as the leading figure in that struggle. Interestingly, Marie's participation in her daughter's kind of minority government was somewhat voluntary. According to Rosalind K. Marshall, her marriage contract to James provided that if she were widowed, she was free to return to France. That she did not, however, is indicative of both Marie's determined fortitude and her desire to preserve Mary's throne. The first years of Mary, Queen of Scots' life were dominated by a war called the Rough Wooing. England, under Henry VIII, invaded Scotland to try and force through a marriage between Mary and his son Edward, through which Henry hoped to seize control of Scotland, as Mary would undoubtedly be expected to move south. The backdrop of this conflict, however, was Scotland's most interminable foreign policy, the Old Alliance. This relationship, which had kind of waxed and waned since its creation in 1296, centred on France and Scotland promising to help the other against England. If England invaded France, Scotland was expected to kind of harry the northern borders, and if England invaded Scotland, France was expected to aid with money, arms and troops. Marie de Guise favoured France, obviously, and so was dead against any marriage between her daughter and Henry's heir. She secured French military support against this English invasion in return for betrothing Mary to the French Dauphin, Francis. This meant that Mary would one day be Queen of France, although the betrothal also offered Francis the potential to one day be King of Scotland. Regardless, the betrothal was made in the 1548 Treaty of Haddington, and a month later Mary herself sailed for the French court. But Marie did not, instead remaining in Scotland to secure the kingdom and preserve the old alliance that she no doubt hoped would eventually be embodied by a royal grandson. Marie set about impressing upon the Scots nobles the benefits of a French alliance. One former enemy of hers, James Hamilton, was made the Duke of Châtellerault in 1549, and in 1550 she took a large retinue to France on what has been called a team building exercise, which I just absolutely love. Let me tell you, any place that I've worked, if they took me on a trip to France, that I would feel that the team had been built, you know? Marie's dedication to the French cause did not preclude her involvement in Anglo-Scottish relations. She returned to Scotland from this trip via England, visiting her daughter's first cousin, once removed and former betrothed, King Edward VI, at Hampton Court. In 1554, Marie was formally named regent for her daughter Mary, who was at that point 11 years old, and this was an office Marie would retain until her death 6 years later. As regent, she was just as politically active as she had been before, despite opposition to her regency, and she wrote to her brother, quote, "God knows, brother, what a life I lead. It is no small thing to bring a young nation to a state of perfection. Happy is he who has least to do with worldly affairs. I can safely say that for 20 years past I have not had 1 year of rest." In 1558, Marie married the Dauphin Francis at Notre Dame, so Marie's kind of ambitions were coming to fruition. However, her daughter's kingdom was now plagued by more domestic threats, which would soon be personified in the creature of John Knox. For the earliest days of Scotland's Protestant Revolution, Knox was actually still in exile, but in 1559 he returned amidst iconoclasm, radical demands for reform, and an ever-deepening divide between the Catholic Queen Regent and a coalition of Protestant nobles named the Lords of the Congregation. Civil war broke out, complete with temporary truces and the odd nobles switching sides. Marie was once again relying on French military support, but the Lords now enjoyed the backing of their southern neighbour. Elizabeth I had recently succeeded her half-sister Mary as queen and set about entrenching in England Protestantism proper, and in early 1560 Elizabeth sent men to besiege Leith, a port to the north of Edinburgh. Meanwhile, Marie's domestic support was evaporating and she became severely unwell. In June, she summoned both her stepson and her former rival, James Hamilton, asked them to kind of stick with the French alliance, and in the early hours of the 11th of June 1560, Marie de Guise died. With Marie's death, the Catholic cause in Scotland seemingly had no champion, and in August of 1560, Scotland's Protestant faction triumphed as the so-called Reformation Parliament officially converted the nation to Protestantism. Except Marie de Guise, of course, was simply a caretaker, and Scotland's actual ruler remained staunchly Catholic and had recently become Queen of France after the death of her father-in-law in 1559. Unfortunately for Mary Stuart, her tenure as France's queen would be brief. In December of 1560, her husband died, leaving Mary with no choice really but to return to Scotland. Mary ultimately decided to let the Protestant Revolution in Scotland stand on the condition that she personally was permitted to practice Catholicism. To some historians, this arrangement was kind of doomed from the start. It's me, I'm historians, and it might seem a bit of a, a spit in the face to her mother's legacy, though I'd wager that Marie would kind of understand her daughter's pragmatism. As to their personal relationship, the pair obviously spent, the best part of 12 years apart from one another, though of course staying in touch. Mary was devastated to hear of her mother's death and attended her funeral, which took place in France. Marie had no idea how her daughter's realm would fare or where her life might take her, though 2 decades in captivity at the hands of her cousin was probably not high on Marie's list of predictions. But a biographer sums up Marie's life between 1542 and 1560 thus, quote, "Sacrificing her own comfort, interests, and ultimately her life, Mary of Guise had fought a long, desperate, and in the end hopeless struggle to preserve Scotland as a pro-French Roman Catholic nation for her daughter." So we've discussed a range of kind of positive relationships where mothers seem to have, or at least believe that they had, their daughter's best interests at heart. But this was not always the case. Marguerite of Savoy was the daughter of a true femme formidable, Louise of Savoy, and her husband, Charles the Count of Angoulême. Charles had a distant claim to the throne of France as the great-grandson of King Charles V, and when he died in 1496, that claim passed to Marguerite's younger brother Francis. Francis was not really expected to inherit, but after Charles VIII and Louis XII died without legitimate male issue, Francis became the king in 1515, having married Louis XII's daughter Claude the year prior. Much of Marguerite and Louise's energies were spent on their Caesar, as Louise kind of wrote of him once, but Marguerite had her own life and career. She married twice and became Queen of Navarre in 1526 after marrying its king, Henri II. Marguerite and Henri had 2 children, Jeanne and Jean, but Jean died in infancy, leaving Jeanne the sole heir to Navarre. As a result, Jeanne was a very eligible bride on the European marriage market, and negotiations began in 1537 when she was about 8 years old. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V offered his son Philip, who was of an age with Jeanne, in the hopes of cementing the Spanish annexation of Navarre, which his forebears had begun. But Jeanne's uncle, Francis I of France, had no intention of allowing his niece to marry into the Habsburg dynasty, and instead commanded Jeanne to marry William, the Duke of Jülich-Clevesburg, who was actually the brother of Anne of Cleves.
I don't know what I was trying to say when I was like, Francis instead commanded her. That doesn't make any sense. I think I meant to say instead commanded her, but maybe I might have got confused with being like Francis intended for this to happen. But yeah, who knows? Who knows?
Marguerite appears quite conflicted here. Her husband favoured Charles V's proposal, but Marguerite's kind of loyalty to her brother was almost insurmountable. She writes to her brother at one point in the kind of usual very intense language of this period that Marguerite, her husband, and Jeanne would all, quote, rather to see Jeanne dead than commit any deed against your intention meaning France's wishes. And so in 1540 the Cleves contract is drawn up, but Jeanne proclaims herself virulently against the match, and when her uncle brought the Duke of Cleves to her, she wept, stating, quote, she would rather throw herself down a well than marry the Duke of Cleves. Now, since the high medieval period, the Western Church only allowed marriages that were undertaken with consent from both parties. There's a whole host of complicating factors that took place across all rungs of society, but in essence, a marriage could be null or void if one party could prove they were unwilling. More on that shortly. Francis was furious at his niece's disobedience, and Marguerite seemingly kind of cleaves. Get it? To her brother, writing to him of her disappointment that Jeanne was unable to recognise, quote, the great honour you conferred upon her by condescending to visit her. But Charles V was no longer quite so interested, so the Cleves marriage ended up going ahead. However, after a few years, the Duke of Cleves abandoned his French alliance for Charles V, and so Francis determined to have his niece's marriage annulled on 2 bases. 1, it had not been consummated, and 2, that Jeanne was unwilling. It's quite the cognitive dissonance that Francis and Marguerite kind of rode roughshod over Jeanne's own wishes, only to rely on the very protest that they had ignored. Jeanne said at several points that her mother essentially forced her into this. She wrote at one point that Marguerite had, quote, had her threatened and beaten by Jeanne's governess, and that Marguerite had promised Jeanne that she would be, quote, so beaten and maltreated that I would die if she did not acquiesce to France's wishes. Later, Jeanne wrote that her father, Henri of Navarre, had, quote, endured the Cleves marriage rather than consented in order not to anger the king, and that Jeanne herself only consented, quote, out of fear and respect for her uncle and her mother, whom her brother had won over. To complicate the picture further, Sarah Gristwood relates the account given by a Spanish spy, Juan Martinez de Escura, that Marguerite was partially responsible for Jeanne's initial outburst, and that Marguerite had encouraged her daughter's disobedience in order to delay the marriage. As we discussed earlier with Margaret Tudor, many mothers wanted to delay their daughters' weddings. The age of majority for girls at this point was 12, which is of course incredibly troubling, although in Northern Europe, at least kind of at this time, it was not the norm for the majority of people, the majority of girls, to get married at that point. They may not actually marry until kind of well into their 20s, but these younger marriages were more common in the kind of upper elite, as these marriages had such kind of political significance. It stands to reason that many women who had experience of these early marriages, either personally or kind of in their family or household, they probably understood the physical risks of both sexual intercourse and pregnancy at that age. Margaret Beaufort's difficulty at birthing her only child, Henry Tudor, at the age of 13, is kind of testament to that. So that Marguerite potentially wanted to delay the marriage of Jeanne, who had not reached 13 at the time of the wedding, is highly probable. Gristwood theorises that Marguerite may have actually encouraged Jeanne's protest, but then kind of ended up backtracking and ultimately kind of abandoning her daughter in this ploy. Regardless, the marriage was annulled in November of 1545, but it's likely Jeanne's relationship with her mother never recovered. I want to finish off with some kind of miscellaneous and slightly more uplifting mother-daughter sets, including some who were not biologically related. Margaret of York was the sister of Edward IV of England and the third wife of Charles the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy. Charles already had a daughter named Mary, and Margaret was especially close to her stepdaughter and also her mother-in-law, Isabella of Portugal. Mary would one day write of her stepmother that she, quote, had always held our person and our lands and lordships in such complete and perfect love and goodwill that we can never sufficiently repay and recompense her. Charles hoped that Margaret would give him a son, but the marriage was ultimately childless, so when Charles died in 1447, Mary inherited her father's vast territories, earning her the title Mary the Rich. The King of France at this time, Louis XI, immediately pounced to try and relieve the 20-year-old Mary of some of that inheritance, but Margaret and Mary were having none of it. They arranged a marriage between Mary and the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I on the basis that, to quote Sharon Jansen, only an imperial marriage could save Burgundy from France, and both Margaret and Mary signed the marriage agreement. The wedding took place and Mary had 2 children with Maximilian, Margaret, named for her step-grandmother and generally known as Margaret of Austria, and Philip, sometimes generously called Philip the Handsome. However, Mary died at the age of just 25, and although she may have intended for her children to be cared for by her stepmother, Margaret of York's court at Mechlin was only home to Philip, and not the young Margaret, who had been betrothed to the French Dauphin, although this marriage would never end up taking place. Nevertheless, Margaret of York kind of maintained a maternal role in the lives of both of her step-grandchildren. One historian writes that Margaret of Austria, who eventually took over the palace at Mechlin, quote, seems to have inherited much more than material goods and servants from her namesake. What I find interesting about Margaret of York's life is that she was not from Burgundy. She was no relation to Mary or her children. She may have been some kind of very distant relationship because European royal families, but regardless, Margaret kind of championed them so fiercely. So much of power in this era of kind of like absolute feudal monarchy is a zero-sum game. Someone has to be at the bottom of the wheel of fortune, and with men and women in this period, to win often meant that someone else had to lose. But in this situation, Margaret kind of allies herself so firmly with her family's interests that when one triumphs, they all do. Margaret of York kind of fulfills some of the roles I've discussed earlier in this video. She helped to organise Mary's marriage, she preserved the independence of Mary's inheritance and kind of tried to positively influence and care for Mary's children. And she didn't really have to. At the time of Charles the Bold's death in 1477, her brother Edward was still King of England, so she could well have returned home, where her own mother, Cecily Neville, was still alive, as was her sister Elizabeth. But she stayed, and I think it's clear that there was great affection between Margaret of York and the kind of female relatives that she gained through the marriage to Charles. Eleanor of Aquitaine's career as royal mother could often be explosive. She was the Queen of Henry II of England, who incidentally was the grandson of our old friend Edith Matilda. Eleanor and Henry had 8 children together, 5 sons and 3 daughters, and all but one of the sons lived to adulthood. Henry's sons had an inconvenient habit of rebelling against him, and Eleanor had a remarkable propensity to join in. She endured 16 years of captivity for her role in her eldest son's rebellion, and she wasn't really properly free until after Henry's death. So it might seem surprising that the pair were buried alongside one another in Fontevraud Abbey in France. Or they were. The French Revolution kind of did its French revolutioning, and the bodily remains disappeared, but the tomb effigies are still there. Alongside the pair was buried their son, Richard I, often known as Richard the Lionheart, but also there is their daughter Joan and their daughter-in-law Isabella of Angoulême, the wife of King John, usually known as the phony King of England. Joan had grown up at Fontevraud. She eventually became the Queen of Sicily as the wife of William II of Sicily. She then became Countess of Toulouse by marriage to her second husband, Raymond VI of Toulouse. Isabella of Angoulême was, like her mother-in-law, a wealthy heiress. She was married to King John at the age of 12, but her more explicit politicking doesn't really take place until after John's death in 1216 and Isabella's remarriage in 1220, after which she contests with her son regarding her dower lands in England. In her later life, however, she retired to Fontevraud Abbey, where, as I said, she was then buried. She was actually buried, apparently by her wishes, outside of the abbey, but her son, who is now Henry III of England, had her remains moved indoors to join her in-laws. The most probable explanation for this kind of like grave grouping is that Fontevraud was associated with the Plantagenet dynasty, which was kind of relatively new as the ruling family of England, and it was derived from Henry II's father, Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou. Based on that, once Henry II was buried there, it follows that his wife, son, daughter and daughter-in-law would be buried alongside him. When I looked up the kind of biographies of these women, all of the major details of their life centered on men, and I can understand why. You know, Eleanor literally joined an attempted coup on her husband. Joan made two very illustrious, important marriages, and regarding Isabella, there's kind of a lot of interest in her marriage to King John and whether or not it was a love match, and of course her second marriage then kind of resulted in conflict with her son. But there's almost no mention of their relationships with other women. Their mothers are referenced and the names of their daughters are listed, but I think it's interesting how much focus there is on the kind of interpersonal relationships between wives and husbands, sometimes of fathers and sons, but very little on mothers and daughters. Now, the very nature of documentary evidence kind of favours the footprints of great men, but that does not mean that these details are not out there. It doesn't mean that we should kind of allow these mother-daughter relationships to slip through the cracks. There's much scholarship dedicated to mothers and sons, particularly how widowed mothers sought to raise their sons, particularly if those sons were kings or dukes. That's what my master's dissertation focused on. But I think we need to kind of consider these more women-centric relationships and social circles, not only as evidence of, you know, women just like vibing, for want of a better word, though that is certainly important, but there is like a world of women right under our noses. I posted a reel a few days ago about this kind of fallacy that queens in medieval Europe didn't have any power, and someone dutifully commented that these women were often just seen as baby making machines, and that to me implies that an emphasis on their maternity is regressive and kind of limiting. It kind of implies that, well, if this woman was valued primarily for having children, she must have been considered otherwise unimportant. In this period, dynastic stability was the goal of every monarch, every royal, every aristocrat, every noble. They wanted to secure their hold on power and ensure that hold remained in their family. So a woman being good for nothing but having children is actually enormously important according to the rules of the day. And that's key, because I think we are assuming that a low value was assigned to having children. And we're looking at it from a decidedly modern perspective. You see similar discussions surrounding women kind of in the gentry and lower classes working in the home in this period. The idea of kind of a housewife is seen by many today as kind of intrinsically unemancipated, as a kind of, you know, an inherently subjugated, oppressed position, whereas in reality it could offer many women prosperity and security. The relevance of this to kind of maternal mother-daughter relationships is that we are beginning to recognise how important, how complex and how politically significant these relationships might be. Not only are we exploring, you know, as best we can, the intimate and kind of emotional relationships between these individuals, but the family structure, the relationship between children and parents. We can see in these daughters the ambitions of their mothers, the priorities of queens and duchesses revealed in how they treated their daughters. By the same token, we might unravel how these daughters felt about their mothers, how they might have understood their kind of position, their destiny, the familial legacy with which they were entrusted. What did they consider good or honourable or shocking? What did they fear? What did they desire? What did they dread? What did they feel about themselves, and what did they want others to feel about them? Focusing on the maternity of these women is not inherently unfeminist in terms of historiographic trends today. Are there any of these kind of mother-daughter relationships that you found really interesting? Are there any kind of relationships that I did not mention that you find interesting and kind of want to tell me about? Please do drop it in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time. He ain't all that. Philip the mediocre. You know that someone's significant in the history of whatever country they were involved in when the issue is like a separate section on Wikipedia, and when there is a whole Wikipedia page dedicated to the children of that person. I'm looking at you, Edward III. Then, you know, the sky's the limit, really.